So Henry, I wanted to actually start with New Power, as Vince referred to. You finished that book how many years ago?
10 years.
10 years ago.
When I was young and dynamic.
Yes, so sad to see you today. Well, when it came out, it was a revolutionary book, especially in its description of power, which I loved. You described old power as being something like a currency, and you got your power and you kept your power by hoarding it. And you described new power as being more like a current. You get that power by channeling and connecting and sharing. And you use that to really make a critique of legacy institutions, but also to put forward really exciting ideas about how to have impact. So looking back 10 years, what have you learned? And how do you think the people in this room, most of whom work in philanthropy, should think about how they wield the power they have? I'll give you one clue. When he was with us at the CEP board meeting, he made us go through an exercise about how would we as philanthropy make impact if we had no money to give away, just as an example. But what have you learned, and what would you say to us?
Well, first of all, welcome to Lincoln Center. It's lovely to have you all here. We're especially pleased to have the community here with us. I think that 10 years ago, we were actually in a very similar spot as we are today. So, a new technology was emerging. There was a lot of kind of giddy optimism about how wonderful it was going to be. There were lots of conversations about how it was going to, quote, change the world, close quotes. There were lots of effective advocacy lines coming from the owners of the technology, that this was going to liberate us, free us, democratize us, help us. And we got stuck in a bit of a debate between everything's going to change and nothing's going to change. Right, so organizations in particular would fall into one of two camps, kind of the overly optimistic and the overly scrutinous. And the New Power book was really the beginning of Web 2.0, so social media was really beginning to grow. And there was quite a thin conversation back then, which was some version of, did Twitter cause the Arab Spring? So it was quite a kind of small, quite a narrow conversation. And what we wanted to write about then was really, I think, the thing we should be talking about now, which is when we see these changes on technology, we often focus a lot on the technology that is changing, and we don't focus enough on how power is changing. And so what we tried to do with the New Power work, my colleague Jeremy Heimans, was to lay out a decade coming, what was going to happen in terms of power flows and how was that going to change. And we got some of it right and we got some of it wrong. So the things I think we got right was we did argue that the kind of much more decentralized, distributed power would have very significant influences across all fields. And we don't need to list the examples, but everything from Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter to the rise of Trump to the rise of Obama to the rise of Bolsonaro. You can go around the world from to left and to right, and you can see these figures who work out how to channel this new power becoming incredibly effective. So we certainly saw a lot of rise of new power. We saw, I think, too, actually, old power hanging on quite effectively. I think a lot of organizations who people thought would be toppled ended up not being toppled in some interesting ways. And the thing which was perhaps most important was what we really saw was the combination of old power and new power being the most effective spot on the board. So if you think about a Meta, for example, extraordinarily effective at harnessing new power. So the only reason their platforms exist is because we volunteer our data to them on a daily basis. Arguably, the greatest act of philanthropy in history is the data that we donate to these platforms every day. And yet, for all of the democratic language of these platforms, the governance, of course, is incredibly centralized and incredibly narrow. So we have this very interesting thing, and we did predict this in the book. I remember when we wrote the book, we talked about the platforms, this was 10 years ago, being participation farms, which at the time was quite strong language. These are participation farms, but I think it really does hold up. And when we think about where we are now in the world, we're in a position, I think, where which is when you write one of these books, particularly a business book, there's always a great danger that you have a theory that folds after 12 months and it kind of falls apart. I think this has held up largely because I think actually if you think about the battles of the world now, they remain this very significant standoff between old power and new power. And for the people in this room, most of you still are very strong on old power. You've got a lot of money to give away, you've got a lot of status, you've got very few people who will tell you the truth about how they think you're behaving, and you've got lots of people who want to be in your good graces, right? So you have a lot of power, and I go a step further and argue that most of you in this room would like to have more new power, right? Most of you actually would like to be able to build movements around the things that you care about, but it can be quite hard to build the new power around an old power institution. And that's been the things I've been thinking about, but also the work I've been doing.
Well, so let's take that a step further, which is, when you think about civic engagement, the public, and you think about its relationship to journalism and to media, how do you think we're doing on that? And how do you, whether it's old power or new power, it seems as if we have a major kind of disconnect there.
I think that's right. I mean, we all know this in the room, but the media are no longer the media. The media was disintermediated. What's in the middle now, which what the media is to do, are essentially platforms who decide what content gets to where. So I think one of the things that we did predict in the book 10 years ago, which we didn't get right, was we thought there would be a greater consciousness of normal people around their digital rights, around citizenship, the idea of any kind of digital citizenship. And there have been lots of glorious artisanal examples. So there are lots of kind of small-scale examples of people doing good things in a democratic way. But on the whole, we haven't developed a consciousness around a democratic consciousness around how we behave online. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with journalism right now, and media, as you all know. It's not that there isn't good journalism, it's that we need a campaign of people around journalists to make sure that the message gets through. And the danger, and I say this to all of us, right, including Lincoln Center, the danger is we end up which is with something which is enormously worthy, incredibly artisanal and subscale. And I think that's a real danger to our sector.
And a challenge to find business models for it as well. But we'll come back to that. We're going to save time for questions. I'm sure Henry is provoking many. But I want to move on to another topic which you referred to as we started, which is, speaking of power, you have written an important recent article in the Harvard Business Review about AI. So as you said, a new source of power that has the potential to reshape how information flows, how expertise is valued, how value is created. Based on what we learned 10 years ago and in these last 10 years, how much of this is hype and marketing? How much of it is real? What can we learn from the development of previous technologies like social media about how to help technologies develop in such a way that they serve humanity rather than the other way around?
I think the hype question is overhyped, by which I mean, as practitioners, which we all are in this room to one way or another, I think even if you just take the assumption that progress is linear, so assume that AI makes the same progress in the next 3 years as it did the last 3 years, right? Steady state. That will be transformative for everything you care about. Now, the argument that a lot of people think is it's not a linear progression, it's an exponential progression. The reason we're seeing such a pace of adoption and such a speed of technology is the curve doesn't look like this, the curve looks like this. But even if you assume linear, so don't get into the hype conversation, get into the linear conversation, think about how your organization needs to change in the next 3 years to keep up with linear change before you even get to exponential change. So that would be my practitioner's framing. And I always think about this work as a practitioner. We run Lincoln Center here. Like this isn't thought leadership. This is what we do for a living. And we have to think about how this work is going to impact our lives. And the way that AI has become powerful recently, and again, we're back in the same place that people are looking at the wrong thing. We're all getting dazzled by the technology and not thinking about the power. So what we tried to do in this piece was to say, why is AI powerful? What are its sources of power? And what's particularly challenging is you're seeing this new agency emerge around AI. So you're seeing this kind of decision-making capacity emerge, which is something very different. You're seeing this kind of adaptive capacity, which could be very good, right? The capacity of AI to learn, enormous breakthroughs and opportunities in things, particularly like healthcare, but also some pretty obvious dangers. You're seeing this amiability of AI, which makes it powerful, that it's pretending to be our friend.
Scarlett Johansson's voice.
Scarlett Johansson's voice. We wrote in the piece last year that the prediction was that people would have a DSO, a digital significant other. You would have a DSO in your life who would be that person, who would be your Scarlett Johansson, essentially, who would be there to engage you, to talk to you. And you think about disintermediation, or indeed intermediation, and what's beginning to happen is, even now, if you go onto Google, you're still getting, to some degree, some choices, right? You're going down, there's some SEO things at the top, but after that, the algorithm is pointing you to various different places and various different websites. What's much more likely now is someone's going to get in front of Google. So what will happen is there'll be an AI system, maybe it's your digital significant other, who understands you so perfectly that you won't want to go anywhere else. And that will intermediate the intermediators, leaving media and journalism not 2 steps behind, but 3 steps behind. So I think there's actually quite a lot of thought to be had around how AI has become much more powerful, and then what we do about that. And perhaps the most dangerous part of the AI equation, in my mind, is around the arcane nature of this work. And so even the people building this don't fully understand how it's working. It's genuinely a black box, which is quite a convenient excuse, because it's going to be quite easy to say, well, I didn't mean it to do that. The AI has decided to do X, Y, or Z. So all of the things that we saw last time around with technology companies having some very convenient cover to shifting structural systems and then serving all this up in our best interests seems to me a very serious concern.
And I think there's another one that when you talk about black box, and this is where one would wish for journalism, the public has no idea. It thinks it gets made in the cloud by magic. I think, there hasn't been good enough reporting yet about the environmental impact of data centers, which are massive and shrink the water table underneath them, the impact on the human beings who are coding and seeing all of the language to help AI become more intelligent. Why do you think and obviously those companies have no interest in that being part of the equation about decision making. How much are we willing to cost the environment and each other in order to get that DSO? How do you think that kind of civic engagement can be better encouraged?
Well, I think that the example is actually in so much of the work of people in this room that I actually think that you think about one of the ways in which the world can be changed by projects which really do present a different kind of civic engagement can really pay off. And I was looking at some of the examples of the things you've been funding, which have been amazing. Something Hillary and I have been involved in for 10 years is Giving Tuesday. So Giving Tuesday as an act of civic engagement is now raised $11 billion in America, is now in 100 countries around the world where people are mobilizing through technology to do positive things, not just in the fall, but throughout the year. So I think there's lots of work which is possible. The big question for me, though, now, and I don't have a good answer to this, but I think it's the right question, is how we insert ourselves into the debate around AI. Because what's happening right now is the only people who are taken seriously are people who own the technologies or are going to benefit from the technologies. There are no other voices particularly shaping that debate. When you look the congressional hearings were all of the tech barons. The op-eds written are almost all from tech people. We wrote this book. We wrote the new piece in HBR, and 3 people quite close to me, or to me and Jeremy, said to us some version of, you don't have the standing to write this piece. We've been writing about technology. We've been working on technology and social good for 15 years. And yet, because we weren't, quote, AI people, therefore we were discounted from the conversation.
Take a minute on the writer's strike, though, because I think that is an interesting thing also for this room.
I think that shows us the way, actually, because I think one of the things now, we did a convening here a month ago, of leaders from all different sectors to pose the question, how can we make sure we aren't left on the sidelines of this debate? So you think about people who oversee domestic workers, you think about nursing, you think about journalism, you think about academia, you think about media. Actually, we're all on the same team in a way now, which is we cannot just fold our cards and let the game be reset without being heard. So I think one of the really interesting things from the writer's strike is it showed you how collective action could be effective here. So here's the big question. What might the alliance be across sectors of non-technology leaders to get into this debate and start to shape it in favor of a world that we all want to live in, rather than I think where we're heading right now, which is we'll get dazzled by the tech, we'll believe the promises, and we'll fold the cards.
Ooh, I hope we come back to that in the Q&A. But I have one more question I want to ask you before we open it up to all of you, so get ready. So let's go back to this issue of the business models for journalism and this notion of disintermediation. In my business, philanthropy, Giving Tuesday in the U.S. alone raised over $1 billion last year in one day and gave it away in the same day. That is not the way the Ford Foundation functions, let me tell you that. So that's an example, I think, of what happens when you can combine technology, generosity, and direct kind of action that is unmediated. No, these are individual donors deciding where they want to give their money. There's no foundation sitting in the middle, creating a strategy or having a sense of impact. So let's talk a little bit about what it means if we run legacy institutions, whether we're a philanthropist, we're a journalism organization. What does it mean to change a legacy organization so that it can function more in a new power kind of a way? And maybe talk a little bit about your experience here.
I think the way we've always approached this is that the danger is you punish organizations and make them feel like they're pointless. So someone comes in and says, you're all, fusty and the business model's tired and you haven't got anything to offer, and you get this very easy cultural clash between the new and the old. And that's never the answer. The answer, I think, is actually a combination of thinking about how you look to your history to then allow yourself to find your future in a more meaningful way. So even Stanley's amazing film that we've done here at Lincoln Center, so much of the intention of that was to think about, okay, actually, let's think about our history and our traditions. Let's ground ourselves in that as a means of both reckoning with where we've come from, but also taking us to where we need to go. And I think that's such an important, from a legacy organization, this is never either or. It's never the past versus the future. It's never old power versus new power. It's always what's the best balance of both. And I think that's the challenge to everyone in this room, which is not to give up on everything that's got you here, but also not to be captured by it. Because one of the big dangers, I think, is we get confused between our mission and our models. What I mean by that is, particularly as legacy organizations, I've run 2 organizations that had good 20th centuries, right? Lincoln Center, the 92nd Street Y before that. So the thing which you became famous for is a model tied to your mission, but then the world changes, but you don't. So your mission might be one thing, but you get stuck on this model you won't give up. Philanthropy is a good example. You look at the work of philanthropy. We had grant officers. They were very prescripted. It was very cryptic. It took 6 months to get anything back. You had no idea why you were going to get these things. All of these power dynamics that were enshrined.
That's not past tense.
That very much past tense. Nobody in the philanthropy sector behaves like that anymore. So if you go back there is this sense which is that power dynamic. That was never the mission of these organizations. The mission was social justice or to make the world better or to cure disease. But the model got in the way of the mission. So I would say that's one question for everyone here today, which is have that honest conversation. Keep the same mission. Start your organization today, day one. Think about what you'd do if you had no legacy, and let that inform how you think about legacy, because that will get you to the best of both worlds, which I think is the right place to try and end up.
I'd love you to talk about an example of what you've done here. So an analog in philanthropy, at least speaking from the Ford Foundation, we had to ask ourselves, why were most of the grants, we are working on generational changes, things that are going to take generations to put in place, justice, racial justice, a more just and more inclusive, a less unequal society. And we were naive about progress and backlash. And we assumed progress would continue, and we were not prepared, nor were our grantees, for backlash. And we made it worse by the model that we used, which is 1-year project grants, which is an impossible way for organizations that are fighting generational battles and backlash to function. They have to be able to skate ahead of the pack. They need to be able to move in ways that foundations have not yet decided are important or necessary. And we have been working to pivot our models so that we give multi-year general operating grants that just say, we trust you to do the work you do, build your capacity, keep money for reserves, hire better people and pay them better, and get about the work that you do because we believe in you. And that's been a big, still underway shift. It's not everything that the Ford Foundation does. But I've heard you talk about Lincoln Center and performance and performing art, and how if what people want to do now is to perform themselves in engaging or photograph themselves in engaging with art, and here you run these institutions that make you turn off your cell phone when you go into the audience. Talk about how you're trying to open up the campus and the notion of what the arts are about and who they're for.
I mean, this is, again, how we're captured with our mission and our models. You go to any of our shows tonight, I hope you all do. You go to any of our shows tonight, and we'll have, 15,000 people here at Lincoln Center tonight if it's a good night. And all of those people have cell phones in their pockets, and all of those cell phones have connections to much larger networks, and none of them are allowed to take a picture, apart from at the very end of the performance when you see the bows, and the bows aren't really very interesting. So now, we don't want them to, right? The last thing you want to be is in a extraordinary moment of a very quiet moment of a symphony. Last thing you want is me and Hillary getting our phones out in the middle of the piece. But we also can't let our audience come and go without finding a way to plug into them. So this summer, we're trying something called the Digital Encore. And the idea of the Digital Encore is at the end of every performance, there'll be a 3-minute piece designed specifically for you to film and share. So it will be a special turn, it will be a little place, it will be a little dance, it will be the orchestra doing something fun. No matter what it is, it will be the moment that the conductor will turn to the audience and actually tell them all to get their phones out and then give them something to help tell our story. Because so much of the work that I think we've been trying to do at Lincoln Center, which is really the new power shift, is to get people to tell our story in their terms. And what we're so good at as institutions is getting people to tell our story in our terms. Here's what we want you to do, follow our rules, do what we say, rather than creating the context for wider engagement. So we're doing a lot of work around that. And in fact, my colleague Leah Johnson wrote a paper 3.5 years ago, called the Mirror Project, which was the most important thing we've done here in 5 years. And that said 3 things we have to do. 1, we have to reckon with San Juan Hill, and we have to engage with that legacy, which is so important. 2, we have to look at ticketing equity. And so almost this summer, we'll have 500,000 people here at Lincoln Center for free or for choose what you pay prices. Of that 500,000 people, half of them are people of color, half of them are under 45, over half have never been to Lincoln Center before. So it's completely changed our audience. And we'll have to think more broadly about how we connect with our city. So what we've been trying to do over the last 5 years is to reconnect Lincoln Center with our city, to tell the truth about our history, and to engage with a very vibrant city that we were neglecting. And I think as we think about all of our work, it's all a balance around power, especially if you are a powerful organization, as we know that we are, how we use that power to shift in the direction of a greater sense of belonging and justice is the only leadership question that really counts.
Oh, thank you, Henry. Well, I think on that note, let's turn to you. We have a few minutes for a few questions. Any questions?
Hello. Thank you again for this. I get very excited when I hear about power analyses. So I'm curious, the way that you describe new power has existed for a long time simultaneously with old power. And I'm wondering what you think the implications are of that kind of framing that almost kind of like diminishes the power of the new power.
I think there's always been collective power, obviously, of one form or another. And actually, Mary Follett wrote a much neglected book 100 years ago, which was the idea about how you would not have power over, but power through. So the power analysis tracks back a long way in terms of thinking about that. But I think there is something fundamentally different now, which is why we wanted to capture this new power, is the sheer rate of connectivity around the world, even 10 years ago, marked something very different in practice. It felt very different than where we are today. If you go back to my youth, I grew up in the southwest of England. I couldn't participate in the world, and this was as a person of privilege, in any particular ways, right? I remember sitting on my stairs calling Radio Devon, desperately trying to share my views with the radio phone-in station, never very successfully. And if I wanted to learn about something, I'd go to the library and get the encyclopedia out and look under the letter that I was interested in finding out about. The participatory capacities of young people today, in fact, all people today, is markedly different, and that shifted the power. So we called it new power, not actually from an academic perspective, but from a practitioner's perspective, which is if you're in any of the seats in this room, what just happened to you felt very new. And I'll make another prediction. What's about to happen next will feel even more radical, because actually the shift we are seeing beginning now, the amount of compute energy, the amount of engineering focus, the amount of capital behind these new systems is so significant that we're going to see 2 or 3 years from now, I think, a very stark shift in power again. And we, as those, I hope, largely on the size of the angels, need to get ahead of that.
One more question. Thank you, Henry.
As someone who understands old power and new power and has all kinds of privilege within the powerful, what are the 2 or 3 things you will do in the next short time to really capitalize on what's going to change?
So look, the most important thing I think we think about in terms of power is representation with Lincoln Center. So one of the things that we've tried to do here is think about who has power in an organization. So our board of directors now is 40% people of color and 50-50 on gender. Our executive staff is majority women, majority people of color. That's also true of our senior staff. David Geffen Hall, which we built through the pandemic, was built 42% of the contracts with minority and women business enterprises. And what we've tried to do in everything that we do, we think about supply chains, we think about how we spend our money, is to make sure that our dialogue about power doesn't just work on Instagram, but works with the P&L, right? So how does it actually change the money of the organization and where it's being spent? We have a very long way to go as an institution, no question. Nobody here is taking a bow, but I can say with great pride in my team that what we've achieved over the last 5 years is it is now a very different Lincoln Center in terms of how we have deployed our power. I think New York is better for it. I think we're better for it. And I think we're just getting started.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Come see a show.